For more than 40 years, every UK government has promised to close the gap between our richest and poorest localities. And for 40 years, on most measures, the gap has actually widened between rich and poor local economies. So let me put an uncomfortable question to you. What if it's the policy system that we keep relying on to fix the problem is actually broken and is actually a big part of the reason why we haven't addressed these local economic disparities? I'm Glenn Athey. I've spent over 30 years working in local and regional economic development, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Birmingham for the Local Policy Innovation Partnership. As part of that work, I've just published a report called Learning from Policy Failure. The next 10 minutes is going to be the honest version of what I found out, and more importantly, what we can do about it. Firstly, the scale of the problem. The UK is now one of the most regionally unequal countries in the industrialised world. Here's a number that stops people in their tracks. In 2020, 8 of our 12 UK regions and nations had gross value added per worker, that is, the value of economic output per worker, below the lowest performing former East German state of Thuringia. Thuringia is the weakest performing of the former East German states or Länder. Outside London, the southeast and the east of England and Scotland, almost every UK region or nation was poorer per worker than the worst performing region of the former East Germany. Now that is quite a shocking statistic. And economic performance isn't improving. In 2023, 144 out of 350 local authority areas across England, Scotland and Wales had an economic output per head at or below 75% of the UK average. This accounted for 42% of the UK population. And deprivation is just as entrenched. 4/5 of the most deprived neighbourhoods in 2019 was still the most deprived in 2025. Now, those of us who work in local and regional economic development and regeneration, we tend to ask ourselves some very introspective questions. Is our analysis of the local economy right? Were our solutions and delivery as good as they could have been? And we often, because we're so dependent on the UK national government for funding, we're waiting for the next funding programme, and we tell ourselves, surely they'll have learned that the last funding programme didn't work so well. Surely the next funding programme will be better and we can deliver better solutions. So we wait for this next national programme. We tell ourselves we'll make the best of it. But what we almost never stop to ask is whether there's something systematic about national policy and the way our politics work that keeps blocking progress in addressing local economic disparities and inequalities. So this is the question I wanted to test through my LPIP Policy Fellow research. To do that, I borrowed from a field of academic research and specialism that most economic policy and economic development policy people and practitioners never touch. It's the academic study of policy failure. It's a serious discipline with decades of theory and research and case studies. So I looked at the policy failure research and literature and evidence, and it gave me a framework, a way of testing a policy, not by whether it was popular, but by whether it was honestly diagnosed, properly resourced, and actually deliverable on the ground. I then took 8 major policy instruments, as you can see on the slide, from regional development agencies and local enterprise partnerships through to the Levelling Up Fund and the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. And I ran every one of them through this policy failure framework to explore whether they had the characteristics or dynamics of policy failure, to see whether they had actually qualified as a policy failure because they did not address local economic disparities and inequalities. And so here's what struck me from my analysis. Across all of these 8 policies that have attempted to address local economic disparities and inequalities from different political parties over 2 decades, the same 10 failures kept showing up in my analysis. These included misdiagnosing deep structural problems as short-term problems or short-term shocks. Policies were often launched with no real testing beforehand, no deep deliberation or appraisal of whether they'd work or whether they were the answer to the solution. Chronic underfunding was apparent. The erosion of the local delivery capacity through austerity policies from 2010 onwards, and competitive and fragmented funding systems that created a begging bowl culture. Another area of policy failure was centralised control dressed up as devolution, as in government creates a very prescriptive small-scale grant programme for local government to bid for and use. Also, poor coordination across government departments and functions is apparent in this area. Local economic challenges require joined-up solutions on the ground that can tie up different government services, different processes, different assets, different partners. And so this failed. I think one of the biggest forms of policy failure is there is just no long-term cross-party strategy or policy for addressing local and regional economic disparities and inequalities. The policies, institutions, funding mechanisms, they keep changing with the electoral cycle, and this just isn't appropriate to address very long-term, deep-seated structural economic problems. So these aren't really the failings of one bad policy or scheme or even one political party. The thread running through all of them is this: attempting to solve short-term problems such as a credit crunch, decline of the high street, perhaps a governance gap, spatially, in England, has always been more politically convenient and easier than solving these deep-seated long-term structural problems. Because a short-term acute problem can potentially be solved inside one single electoral cycle, but a century or less of industrial restructuring and change cannot be addressed through one electoral cycle. So one of the main conclusions from this research is that we're in an implementation doom loop in terms of policies that attempt to address local economic disparities and inequalities. I adapted this idea from the business writer Jim Collins, who in business terms described this doom loop as that short-term pressures lead to underinvestment in institutions and capacity in an organisation. This underinvestment leads to delivery failure. Delivery failure creates fresh political pressure for something to be done that's visible and fast. And these quick fixes crowd out the very long-term investment that would have broken this whole cycle of failure. But the doom loop keeps going round, from failure to reaction to failure to reaction, and no attempt to set in place long-term solutions to address long-term problems. And the UK political system adds its own special ingredient into the doom loop. Every incoming government that's new dismantles its predecessor's flagship institutions, so we burn through hard-won capacity faster than we can rebuild it. Austerity from 2011 onwards made it worse, with over £10 billion cut from local government spending power between 2010 and 2018, with the deepest cuts to local government budgets in the poorest places. We hollowed out the very councils we then asked to deliver growth funding later on in the decade. So now for the more hopeful part of this video, the constructive solutions part. England may be turning a corner. The English Devolution and Community Empowerment Act sets out universal coverage by strategic authorities, such as mayoral combined authorities. They get multi-year single pot funding, and they have local growth plans which replace the endless competitive bidding. So that's a genuine welcome return to a strategic formula-based model. But there are two big risks. The first is capacity. This devolution reform is moving faster than we can build the organisations with their workforce and skills to absorb it. The vision's coherent, the workforce strategy underneath it in terms of developing the capacity and capability to deliver on the devolution promise, it isn't clear. The second big risk is reversibility. There's no constitutional protection for local devolution, for mayors, for combined authorities. Powers handed over by a parliamentary act or ministerial discretion can be taken back. Integrated settlements, which are integrated funds for combined authorities, are welcome, but they can be quietly shrunk. And we've seen this hollowing out before with other government institutions. So just to summarise the risks, there's a promise that devolution will solve these local economic problems and disparities, but to deliver they need the capacity, and the capacity has been eroded by austerity. And then there's no constitutional protection for these new devolved authorities, so that we may be in the doom loop again if central government decides they haven't delivered and they decide to re-centralise these powers. So what do we actually do at the local level? What do local leaders need to do? My message to local and regional leaders is: don't wait for the national policy system to change. It's very unlikely. The real room for progress is how we manage, navigate and negotiate within the national policy system. For combined authorities and new devolved institutions and the new unitary authorities, this means building genuinely professional evidence-led institutions. It means setting targets that matter locally instead of chasing national headline ambitions. It means being honest about the trade-offs. And above all, it means delivering visible, demonstrable progress fast enough so that any central government wanting to pull these institutions apart, it becomes politically too costly. So for local leaders, it's about capability, delivery and results. This is what will make a new institution too valuable to fail. So to close, this report may be uncomfortable reading for some, but let's face it, our national policies have failed to address these local economic disparities and inequalities which have been part of the UK's political economy for at least 40 years. But the point isn't to despair, it's the opposite. It's recognise that the policy system itself is a structural cause of failure. rather than a fixed constraint we just have to endure. Recognition is the first step to designing a policy system that works better. So we owe our communities that much to A, improve the national policy system, and to B, be a lot smarter about how we work within that policy system. Thanks for watching. You can access the full report on the links on the LPIP website. I'm Glenn Athey. Thank you.